Hey, Kate Fagan, how are you?
Hi, how's it going?
Going great. All right, I'm Devan Torrance. I'm here today with Friendly City Bookstore from Columbus, Mississippi, and we are interviewing author Kate Fagan. Kate Fagan is an award winning journalist and the number one New York Times bestselling author of What Made Maddie Run, which was a semifinalist for the PEN ESPN Award for Literary Sportswriting. She is also the author of three additional nonfiction titles, a former professional basketball player, and spent 7 years as a journalist at ESPN. Kate currently lives in Charleston with her wife, Kathryn Budig, and their dog, Ragnar. Sound good?
That's perfect.
Awesome. So Ragnar is there with you today. Am I saying his name correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ragnar, like the Viking. I'm like backwards here. There he is right there. Nope,
I
he's over
know.
there.
He's just hanging out with you, like the Viking. Yes.
Yep, he's
Super
a Viking.
cute. Super cute. I
He's
have a
so
beagle
cute.
here at my feet.
Good.
Most of our listeners will know Scarlett. Scarlett is our little mascot here at the bookstore. She's teeny tiny, smallest beagle I've ever seen. But yeah, so I'm glad that the dogs are here with us for this
Yes.
interview today. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Kate Fagan, your new book, The Three Lives of Kate K, comes out January. Is that correct?
January 7th,
Uh,
2025.
This is actually January 7th, everybody, the day after Epiphany. There you go. So, The Three Lives of Kate K is your first fiction novel. Now, I've been a fan of your work for a while, followed your journalism career a good bit as a sports enthusiast. I love a lot of your journalism stuff. Of course, you have two really great nonfiction books that I've read um, before listening to your podcast. They kind of come across my radar. And then you had a recent nonfiction book about your father that came out, and now you're getting into the world of fiction. Let's talk about that a little bit. What was that shift like for you?
Well, I had always wanted to write fiction
Mm-hmm.
since I was young. And then when I stopped playing basketball in my early 20s, my goal was to write fiction, but I had a couple problems. I didn't know how to write. I hadn't studied writing. I'd really just studied basketball. And I also didn't have any money and just didn't really have the space and the resources to just sit around writing a book and hope that it would sell. So that's how I got started in journalism, was because I was like, well, a small newspaper, I'll learn how to write, I can pay some my bills. And then I'd been in that world for, wow, it's coming up on almost 20 years. But in the back of my mind, I had written over the years, I'd written manuscripts that just weren't good. So I'd attempted to write fiction throughout that 15, 20 years, probably three or four full manuscripts. And it was just always in my mind that that's what I wanted to try again and like really, really immerse myself in it, rather than having it be a project I was doing in the off season, like when I was a beat writer. I just really wanted to take it seriously. And so this book, The Three Lives of Kate K, was the first time when I really, really wrote in the same way that I might write like a column, where you're just kind of poring over every sentence and you're trying to really make the ideas and the transitions work. That was the first time I'd really been able to do that with fiction. And so it had always been a dream to get to the point where I could write, not have it be about someone else and have to rely on their story, but just kind of create one in your own mind.
Hmm. And I want to get into a couple of things that you said there, specifically the one you said about creating your own characters at the end. But I want to touch quickly on when your earlier part of your writing career, you were like, I didn't have the space, the energy, the money, the time to really make it happen. And I also knew that I lacked the experience in that sort of realm of fiction writing. Do you think any of those earlier manuscripts, while you say, quote unquote, not good, do you still think they provided some sort of education for you? Like the ability to write fiction writing while also doing journalism work? What was that process like?
I mean, I think some of those manuscripts that didn't work, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure, the correct answer is like they all led me to where I am now.
Hmm.
But I really didn't take it seriously enough at that time. Like I really, when I was writing fiction, when I was like mid 20s and then, early 30s, each time I sat down and tried it, I really was beholden to the word count, like of my day's output. And that
Mm.
was the only metric I really cared about. I was like, I'm writing a novel this summer, and every day I need to write, 500 to 800 words. And I just didn't really understand the level of editing that they needed. It was very much like, as long as I finish a manuscript, then that's a book.
Mm.
And so, and I never really got to the place where I understood the depth of the amount of editing that would go into it. Like this book, The Three Lives of Kate K, I went through a minimum of 7 rewrites on it. And it's not like it
Oh,
was
wow.
not every single one of those was like a full rewrite, but many of them were like really deeply rewriting the book. So as far as the question of like those earlier manuscripts, like it's not like I read them now and I'm like, oh, there's a lot of merit there. I just think, oh, I just had no clue what I was doing. I mean, this was
Mm.
before I even understood how to write nonfiction or write at all. Or I just kind of thought, oh, words on paper equals book. It was
Right.
not the best formula.
I've taken several creative writing classes, and that's one of the big things they teach you, right? Is just write so many words a day, get so many words done per week, even if it's crap. But as you get older, you realize, no, that's not necessarily true. The majority of your work will be done in post, right? It's done editing. It's done almost as much as a nonfiction writer. You want to be true to the facts and review and review and review and make sure that you're being true to the story you're trying to tell. So you're saying that in nonfiction or in fiction, excuse me, in fiction, you spend just as much time reviewing and trying to get those details correct.
Oh, I think more. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that at least that's been my experience because you know, all my previous books all being nonfiction, I certainly went through an editing process, but there is a limitation to that process. Once things are generally factually correct and you feel like you're conveying it in the best possible way, like you kind of hit a dead end. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
with this, you could be going through one version of it and then your editor or you think, do we need that character anymore? Or why don't we make that character live in this state instead of that state and have this job instead of that job because it makes more sense for their behavior. And then you do it. Whereas, What Made Maddie Run, a nonfiction book I put out, wow, almost now like 10 years ago. You just get to a point where you're like, this is the research I've collected. This is what I've gathered. This is how I'm writing it. And then you're done. Not that you
Mm-hmm.
don't have a couple manuscript like editing processes, but like it's just with fiction, it's like you could keep thinking of new, better ways to structure your character's backstory that makes their present actions more cohesive. I could still be doing that. I mean, I've read through this book since and been like, I wish I had done that
Mm.
there. And so that was really surprising to me, thinking, oh, it's fiction. I like it would be less editing, but that was definitely not my experience.
Whew, that's a lot of pressure. It's
Yeah.
probably good you didn't know how much going into this fiction world, how much pressure and control that you have in that way, because that would be overwhelming. I can tell for myself that'd be really overwhelming that I'm going to rethink this thing so
Yes.
many times and so many things that I potentially could change about it. It's like the doors just keep opening that you could
Yep.
potentially go through. Yeah,
Yes.
that's a lot.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about, and you mentioned like your editor would bring up, well, what if we put this person in this state? What if we, do this with this character? Talk to me a little bit about character development because The Three Lives of Kate K has a very interesting plot. I think that readers are going to enjoy following what happens to these people, but more so how they evolve, how their characters develop over time. So you do a great job creating characters that are both likable, not likable at the same time, believable, very flawed, very complex. That has to be the hardest thing, probably for many writers, to get onto the page, right? Get a character onto the page that you can relate to or not relate to, or at least understand where they're coming from. So, what was that like compared to nonfiction writing, the development of characters?
I mean, they're there really is no comparison between
Mm.
nonfiction and fiction when it comes to that. And some of that might be that maybe I wasn't thinking enough about my nonfiction characters, because I mean, I obviously didn't think of them as characters.
Mhm.
Um, and and I think that was the scariest thing for me going into fiction, was having relied my entire career on conversations, on reporting, to understand what made a person tick and what made them do the things they had done, and also to be able to collect the details that made a book. That I think, because I had done that for 15 or 20 years, I was really worried that I would not have the skill set, or the muscles would have atrophied, to be able to build a character out of whole cloth, rather than relying on someone else, to observing someone else. So
Mhm.
that was really scary for me at the outset, thinking I might not have the capability of creating a character that to somebody else would feel real. But I realized then that, I realized during the process of this that, a lot of the observations one makes as a journalist or as a reporter, that skill set of being able to observe things and knowing which details are most interesting and relevant to put into a book or a magazine article, serves you really well in fiction as well, because
Mm.
that is the same muscles. Like, okay, if I am going to write a profile on somebody, my job as a journalist is, because I have the access that every fan or every person who follows that athlete or whoever it is, I have the access. I need to do a really good job of, if I'm in their home or if I'm out to dinner with them, conveying the things that make them them, through noticing the details that separate them from the person next to them. And that is very similar to what you're trying to do when you're building a character. Is like, I've witnessed people's behavior in the real world, and I'm stealing some of that to build a character. Like, I certainly stole things from my wife, the way she speaks or the things she's done, or certain elements of her past. You'll see those infused into, like, the character Ryan Channing in my book. And so, in the end, I feel like this thing I was really scared about, being able to build a character, because you don't build characters in nonfiction. I realized, like, in a way, it is a similar skill set that you are using, which is noticing the details that make a place and a person differentiated from just any place or person.
Yeah, there's a lot to take in. Definitely, you could tell that the details of a person and bringing them to life, you're very conscientious of your audience and what you would want your audience to know about this person, to feel as if they're in the room with you. And a lot of that may come potentially from just being in real world situations, knowing you're going to have to reiterate this person for your audience in the journalism field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that ended up being like, oh, okay. So some of the skill set is transferable. Certainly not
Mhm.
all of it, but that one in particular was one I really leaned on, was like, if it's stuck in my head as an interesting idiosyncrasy of a person, it's probably worth building into a character, because it'll remind readers of somebody in their life like that, or they'll think, oh, that's such like a unique way to speak or talk or think about something, and I've observed it in someone else, and it makes someone feel less like they're coming out of central casting.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
No, definitely. So let me, in that same vein of talking about characters, you have a lot,
Yeah.
and when I describe this book to people, it almost seems like I have to stay up and say, no, 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 don't get overwhelmed by it. There are a lot of characters. There are a lot of places. The plot is interesting. It spans time. There's a lot going on. Like the main character starts off as Anne Marie, turns in, spoiler alert here, guys, but turns into someone named Annie, starts to go by Annie, then goes by Cass, and then goes by Kate K, before ultimately coming back full circle to that identity she chose for herself, her real identity of Annie, right? So you had a lot of characters, you had a lot of places to keep up with. In my mind, I'm envisioning writing this story with like a crime scene whiteboard, where you have like the tape and the sticky notes and the lines that are drawing people to each other. What was that like? How did you keep up with all of it? Because as a reader, it comes across so natural. You don't feel it. The pacing is good, so you don't feel it. But writing it, I'm sure, was much more difficult.
Well, that's a great compliment, that you don't necessarily feel the myriad shifts that are occurring in the book. I think some of that is down to, and I think we do an even better job in the finished copy of like having signposts and mile markers for people, like at the beginning of a chapter. In this book, if you're not paying attention to like the year and the person whose name is at the beginning of the chapter, like you're going to be a little bit lost. So you are relying on a reader to not meet me halfway, but you got to do a little bit of work in this book to be like, I got to be present. I need to, I need to check in at the start and be like, who is this from? Who is this character? And I think I had two editors, one in the US and one in the UK. And they worked great together. We all worked great together. And we tried to build in that infrastructure of like, from the very base level of like, here's a map, right? Every chapter header, you need to know who's speaking. You need to know what year it is. In terms of me writing it, it was kind of chaos. I'm working on another book now, and I'm trying to be a little bit better about like both writing the manuscript and understanding my outline and where I'm headed. And so like and trying to build both of those simultaneously, because for The 3 Lives of Kate, I had really almost no outline. I mean, I had like a general sense of like, I could kind of show you this board I have here. This is for a different book. Like I had something like that, like with some index cards and some thoughts, but like when I look back at it, not a lot of it matched up. So I ended up writing in a program called Scrivener, which a lot of writers use, and it lets you like really see the different chapters you're writing, as opposed to like a Microsoft Word. You can get a little bit lost because oh my God, my whole manuscript's here, but I don't know where any of it is and where it's fitting in. And Scrivener lets you kind of write one character's story, and then you see it over to the left, and then you can write another character. So like from a very logistical standpoint, that was helpful. And then I remember this one day after I basically wrote like one character, Ryan Channing. I think at one point I just wrote 20,000 straight words, and they all involved Ryan. And I didn't know then like what order that would be told in. So there was one day, like a couple months before I started trying to find an agent for this book, where I just put it in an order. And it kind of felt a lot like a magazine article when you're trying to do something different and you're like, I'm going to start at the end and then I'm going to work back. And I put it in an order, which I thought worked. That is not the order it ended up in. We played around with the order all kinds of times. Once we sold the book, with those editors. I mean, I don't recommend, it was a very ambitious thing that I was doing, but I didn't know it was ambitious. To try to piece together like a bunch of different timelines, a bunch of different characters, and try to make it feel like you could follow along seamlessly. That in the end just ended up being like a lot of like labor for me, because every time we rearranged things, like it required a whole manuscript reread, because now you've got one detail that was right to share at this stage, but now you move that chapter up a little bit, and now that detail can't be revealed then. And so look, it's kind of like when you're trying to build something without a blueprint. You just like, it's like an IKEA piece that I had to undo and redo like 3 different times. So I'm going to try to not put myself in that predicament again.
That is intense. That sounds incredibly overwhelming. A lot of people, for their first, major piece of art that they put out there, you think about, I know Lorde has talked about this, her first album she wrote. She's like, this is my entire childhood and my entire teenage years. My first album. She goes, I genuinely don't know, that sophomore slump. I don't know if I'll ever be able to create something as authentic, because I'm not that person anymore. I'm not an authentic person anymore now that I've found this level of fame. Paraphrasing, of course.
Yeah.
But it seems like you're almost saying, I started this process with kind of an idea of where I wanted to go. This is not like a life work that I had in me that was just waiting to come out. I just started this process and jumped in, and the changes just occurred a whole lot throughout the process.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't a project for me where I had like a bucket of information over here,
Hmm.
whether physical or metaphorical, where I was like, every interesting thing I've ever, you know, thought
Hmm.
or ways I'd want to tell a story or characters, and like I'm going to put it over in this bucket, and then now I'm going to put them in this work. It was not like that. It was really, I had started and failed so many fiction projects that when I started this one, there I thought there was a more than 50% chance it just like would die on the vine, you know.
Really?
Yeah, or it was probably about maybe, I would say maybe 30,000 words in, where I was like, no, I think I found a voice here, like that was different than any other fiction thing, which felt like I was just writing words, like kind of like we talked about
Hmm.
earlier. And so I really didn't start this project being like, after 15 years of journalism, I'm now going to pour all of my observations into this piece of fiction. It was not like that at all. It was kind of like a survival mechanism. Like, I've always loved fiction. Let's try it again and see what happens. And then I got deep enough into it that I started to see it was only once I got going then I started to see the things I was interested in about it, like the details that a writer puts in their book, like the details I was selecting from my own life were surprising to me. But then they made sense because I was like, that is a thing I have for some reason thought about for these last 25 years. And it's, of course, it made it into the book because for some reason that's a memory I keep thinking about. And then once I started to realize how I was putting my own life into a book and answering that question, I think a lot of people have about novelists, like, is this your real life thing? And I was like, well, no, this is obviously not my real life, but you could ask me a dozen things about this book and I'd be like, yeah, that's my wife, or that's a place I grew up. But I'm like, but this is totally fiction. And now I understand what they mean when they say that.
Hmm.
Um, and so that for me was really like, it's not even a process. Like, I think working on the second book, I kind of have more of a process now. This book was just like, I kind of just fell in love with it along the way. And then I was like, well, I'm definitely gonna see this through because I feel something in it. It was like making me feel things.
That's really cool that you sort of fell in love with your own artwork throughout time as after you
Nice.
spend time with it. You don't really hear people talk about that often. Usually it's a love-hate relationship, right, with something they're creating and putting out to the world. But to hear an artist say or a writer say, "No, this is something I'm creating that I fell in love with throughout the process and I'm proud of it and I decided to stick with it." I think that's pretty inspiring, especially for a lot of our listeners that I know a lot of people that listen to our podcast are creators. And so I think that's going to definitely be some comforting tidbits to take away there. And I didn't think I was even going to bring this up, but I remember when reading the book that I've, of course, listened to a couple of your podcasts, one about one you do with your wife and one you do about basketball, read your books. And then it didn't feel like I knew you. That was one of the great things is I was like, oh, this doesn't feel at all like the same author, the nonfiction books or of the podcast host. This feels like a completely new and separate thing. And then there would be
Mm.
this moments like the one with the Colosseum, where I remember in your
Yeah.
podcast you mentioned that how you had spent your entire life wanting to see the Colosseum. And then when you got there, you were like, oh, this is it. You know what I mean? This is that
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And I listened to that right before my wife and I moved to New Zealand. And I had this overwhelming fear on the airplane that I was like, what if I get there? And I'm like, Milford Sound? What? So
Yep.
this,
Yep.
it doesn't, just for the audience to know,
Good. I'm
Milford Sound
glad.
is everything you want it to be. Hobbiton, 0 out of 10 stars, very commercialized. But the natural world of New Zealand is everything you want it to be. But those little tidbits that you put in there as a person
Yeah.
make it feel more human and kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about characters feeling like actual people you would grab dinner with or meet at a bar. You get to know them just for a minute and then some deep detail but mostly surface level. So it was really
Yeah.
interesting. Let's see here. Okay, after reading this book, my wife and I both read this book and we were talking about it and we kind of got on this conversation of how there seems to be a gap in serious, quote unquote, serious sapphic fiction, right? And she and I both read a lot of like cozy sapphic fiction. I'm looking at several here, Ashley Herring Blake, for example, that just writes these books that are, geared towards a younger audience, figuring themselves out, coming out stories, first love, whatever. And then a few years ago, and I hope you don't get this comparison a lot, but the Taylor Jenkins Reid put out The Seven Husbands of
Right.
Evelyn Hugo, and that felt like it sort of filled this gap. And in a lot of ways, this book also feels as if it is a serious sapphic romance. How does that land for you?
Well, the publisher's tagline for the book is like Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo meets First Lie Wins.
Mm-hmm.
And I have not read First Lie Wins, and I know it's more thrillerish, and I don't think my book, there's a mystery at the heart of it, but I wouldn't call it a thriller.
Definitely not.
But part of the reason why I started writing this book was, to your point, I finished Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo years after it came out. I didn't like read it initially. So this would have been like 2 years ago, maybe a little less. And then afterward, I was like, okay, I want to read another book that's kind of like that. Like I didn't want to read like a campy lesbian romance about like two soccer players who were on the same high school team. Not that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not that I won't like want to write that book at some point, but I wanted something that felt a little more like, okay, it's Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and now I want like another sort of like piece, like a book that feels like more serious, and like that romance is in it, but it's not about romance necessarily. And when I realized, and I'm not saying that that no books that fill that gap exist at all, but they're not easy to find right now, I would say. And I wanted to write a book for that reader. So I love that comparison. I think that I wanted to write a book, and my characters were basically all going to be queer because of course they were. But I didn't really want to do another book about like the trauma of it. Um, or I didn't want like the heart of the book to be about them recognizing who they are and coming into their sexuality, specifically in the struggles that can come in like the early aughts when a lot of these characters were coming of age. Like, I didn't want to write a book about that. Like, I actually wrote a book called The Reappearing Act about my own coming out on a college basketball team, being in the sports world during certain periods. I had to hear a lot of like young people's coming out stories. I didn't have to, it was an honor, but like I didn't want this book to be that. I really wanted it to just be about the things that people like queer women and men and all people, like about the things they're still actually worried about, like ambition and like uh where to live and how they want to like move in the world. I wanted it to be more about those things, but also when push came to shove, it was going to be sapphic.
Yeah, I definitely hear you when I think of my own like romance story, if you will. My coming out story wasn't the interesting thing, right? I remember coming out to my family and everyone was just like, "Oh, the sky is blue. Things are
Yeah.
the way they are." The
Yeah.
interesting stuff is the navigating the world as a human being,
Yeah.
right? And then this just seems to be just an element of your life that does make it more interesting and more colorful, but it's not this angsty concept that your characters have to deal with throughout the novel. You don't really get that like teenage angst of coming out and coming to age story the way you do with a lot of sapphic fiction novels that are coming out at this time, which we
Yeah.
are thankful for, right? Like we all need a good
Love them.
cozy read
Yeah.
every now and then.
Yeah.
My Goodreads is full of them. It's
Mhm.
literally full of nonfiction about nature and cozy sapphic reads.
Yeah.
So but let's talk about those characters then. Let's kind of switch gears and get into that. Like you've got these two main characters and don't want to get into too many spoilers here, but there is this deep friendship that has a huge breaking point. And that sort of completely the only comparison that's coming to mind right now is Wicked. I think it's because we went and saw it for $5 movie night. I think that's what it is.
Nice.
But it
Yeah.
just completely like changes the trajectory of their lives.
Yeah.
And you know they're meant to come back to each other at some point once you realize, you know, the big spoiler there, that one of the characters is still alive. You know they're going to come back to each other at some points, but you're not sure how it's going to work. And you're not sure if it's going to be this massive reconciliation moment or if it's going to be messy. And you chose the messy route. It is a little messy, right? The way that they come back together and get back into each other's lives and have this conversation. What was writing the ending for you like? That how did you stay true to these characters and the people that you had developed?
Well, the writing the ending, it's kind of reminding me of coming out, because I think that, the age old thing about coming out is like, you actually feel like you're always doing it, right? Like, there's decisions you're making when you're sitting in the Uber or whatever.
Right.
And when it came to the ending, it felt like the ending was never going to end, because I had so many characters and so many perspectives that it felt like it wasn't just, I'm going to write these 5,000 words and that's the ending. It was like, well, you kind of need to see it from Ryan's perspective just a little bit now. You also kind of want to know how this, and so I had one ending and it's still in there, but then my editors were both like, we need more from the ending. And that happened, I want to say 2 to 3 times. And so every time they wanted more from the ending, I was really scared, because I feel like the book does a really good job of building you to the feeling that you need to see this, this moment happen. But I know from movies and books and stuff, like, sometimes my own imagination of what that might be like just can't be replicated. Like, and I was always really scared every time I sat down to write an additional part of this ending, that I was like, can I live up to the emotions that I need these people to feel and that I want them to feel? And so, and also, and I want the reader to do some work too. Like, I can't give them everything. I knew I wanted to write a book that you'll get this reference. Like, I was so angry at Portrait of a Lady on Fire, that ending, that I was like, that's not what I'm going to create, because like, I'm still mad at that movie.
Yes.
Yeah. Like, I still, and I think this other book I'm working on is going to be like a little fan fiction to like rewrite that a little bit. And it's in a different time period. And I don't want to do that to people. Like, I know maybe some people are like, endings don't have to be, not everything has to work out. And I'm like, yeah, but for me and my love stories, I want things to work out,
I do too. Yes.
Yeah.
Like, God, we got enough like heartbreak out here in the world right now, especially when it comes to like, bury your gays, sapphic fiction. You got gay kids, gay characters, especially female characters, not finding a happy ending, not getting to that domesticity, if you will, right? And in a lot of ways, domesticity is the happy ending, that day-to-day life of living with another person. And you create an ending where you could almost see these two getting to be themselves in a certain way, that a lot of stories don't give you. They get to remain true to themselves as characters, but then also it's kind of open-ended where you're not quite sure what that's going to look like. And there's so many possibilities for what their relationship could look like after that last page.
And I appreciate you saying that, because I that was what I was kind of like leaning on the reader to understand, is like, I've taken you to this moment. They're not that far past the moment you've been building toward. And you don't know, in a year from then, one of the characters could turn and be like, I'm still fucking mad at you. And things can implode. Or there could be some messy love triangle in their lives. A year, like, it's just, this is where I ended the book. I wanted to give you some emotional conclusions, but also I just felt like, and I just felt also like I couldn't just write it 360 degrees and make sure everybody knew that like this was the full story, because I was like, I don't know what they're going to go do now. But I definitely 100% was just like, some of like the influences I had, whether it was movies or other books I've read, I knew what I wasn't going to do. I don't love a love story that ends with sadness. I just am like, what did I, that's not a love. That's not,
This is a
even though that
waste
is,
of my time.
yeah,
Like,
like, at least wherever you choose to end it, give me some level of hope, you know?
yes, yes, I can figure it out past the final page, right, for
Yeah.
myself, but give me some level, some foundation to build upon. Right, exactly. And, quickly, let's talk about your secondary characters. You've got Sydney, loved me some Sydney, and you have Ryan, right? So, what was that
Yeah.
like? What was writing secondary characters that are kind of in the background, but kind of not? Because they really do push this plot and they develop our mains in quite a good way and strong way. So, tell me a little bit about writing those secondary characters that flesh out this whole story.
I mean, that part was really challenging too, because I made this decision early on that I was going to write, in first person, but then also because I have published actual memoirs, or there's certain threads of memoir in a lot of the books I've done. I felt like, structuring this book as just one person's memoir and you only hear their voice. So it would have been like this, this book being framed as Kate K's memoir. If it was all first person and it was all Kate K, I felt like you're missing actually seeing how other people in Kate K's world see her, which I think is like a thing about memoir that, and what the reason memoir works is because you get so deep inside one person's story that you get to learn something new. But one of the reasons I think that a memoir is a struggle is because you don't know how people in that person's life actually interact with them, right? Like you could read this whole story from them and then come to find out that like nobody in their life talks to them because they're a big asshole. Like you never get to
Right.
see that part of it. And
Mm-hmm.
so kind of once I got into this into KK a little bit, I'll be like, wouldn't it be interesting if like you get this added dimension of seeing how the people in Kate K's life will talk and write about her and how they saw the things that happened. And so that introduced like, well, all right, who will these other characters be? How will they engage with her? How will they push the story forward? Because I think at the heart of the book is Kate and Amanda. They're the childhood best friends. And so I would say the hardest character for me to write was actually not Sydney. Sydney's a bit of the antagonist, not a bit. She's the antagonist in the book. And I think in different iterations, she didn't do things that were that awful in previous iterations. But then we're raising the stakes, we're raising the stakes. And so it got to a point where like Sydney went from being like the kind of the archetype of that woman you've dated that you just kind of like, why did I fucking date that person? Like that was kind of the inspiration for Sydney, right? Like that bad
Right.
relationship you were in where you were like, that never worked, but like there was one thing that held it together. Like that was the motivation for writing that relationship. But then
So
as it got,
believable.
yeah,
Such a believable character.
because like I have been in many relationships in my life where like if somebody asked me why I was in them, I'd be like, I don't know. Like the person asked me out and then we just kept going out. Right. And like, I don't know if that's a queer thing or just like a human thing, but people just fall into relationships because they're fucking convenient. And that was the archetype of that relationship. But I'm kind of away from your original question, but the farther into drafts we got, the more I kind of pushed Sydney to like be the linchpin to a lot of these plot points. And then Sydney became a challenging character then because like I had to create a character that you could also believe would have done this thing. And like once you raise the stakes of what she's done, you've got to really raise her like psychology to that level.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Mm-hmm.
kind of had to go back through and be like, okay, I need her to be a little bit deeper because I've made her do things that are deeper later on. And you got to kind of understand her better. And so that became challenging, but by far the most challenging character was Ryan Channing,
Really.
because unlike Sydney, who's like got her own vibe, Ryan's vibe is very similar to Kate K's vibe and very similar to Amanda's vibe. Like Amanda and Kate grew up together, so you kind of understand they have the same inside jokes. They're both kind of witty, sarcastic. They're going to see the world a little bit of a similar way. And when I wrote Ryan, she was starting to sound exactly like them.
Mm-hmm.
And that, from a writing perspective, that was challenging for me because I needed to make her distinct. It
Right.
made sense that Amanda and Kate would sound similar, but it didn't necessarily make sense that Kate and Ryan would sound similar. And so I had a big kind of come to Jesus about her last Christmas. And I infused her with a lot of my wife, because my wife graduated from theater from UVA. She lived in LA for a number of years, and the first couple was trying to break into acting. And so we've had and I had certain thoughts about what actors were like, and then I met my wife, and I was like, oh, okay, so like there is somebody can want to be a famous actor and also have stage fright. Like these things are not mutually exclusive. And so I tried to bake some of that into Ryan to make her sound, to differentiate her, but that became very challenging to kind of weave that all the way through the book.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, because I do think that what you said about you get to know your main characters better because you see them through someone else's eyes. You see these other women that have seen them and watched them grow, and even sometimes the exact same moments are reiterated but through a different lens. And I think that really does push the plot, but more importantly develops the characters that we spend the most time with throughout the novel. Yeah, so my final question about this book is settings, because you go a lot of places, and you mentioned your own personal experiences with these locations and your wife's experiences with those locations, but it starts off in Charleston and it ends in Charleston. I love that there's so much time spent in the South that she gets to interact. Kate interacts with characters in the South, and or excuse me, Amanda does. She gets to meet people in the South, and there's little tidbits you add about that. And as a Southern woman, I have to ask, like, what was that like? Was that an intentional move that you made? You're like, oh, I'm in Charleston now, so I'm going to write a little bit about this new place.
Yeah, that was every location in the book I've either lived or spent an exorbitant amount of time. And I don't necessarily think that's necessary, but as we've kind of touched on in this podcast, I have a lot of failed manuscripts, in my metaphorical drawer. And everything about this book at the outset, I was trying to make easy on myself. Like I framed it as a memoir because I understand memoir, and like it was just a way to get into the story. I wanted to set it places I had been because I knew if I put it somewhere I hadn't been, I'd get bogged down in like Googling everything and research. And then what I needed to do was just like get the story down. So and I love Charleston. I moved here. Now it's been about 5-6 years, and coming from upstate New York and then living in New York and being almost exclusively like an East Coast city girl, I was not sure how I was going to like the South, but I did fall in love with it. And so I wanted to set something here, both because, I don't think a ton of stuff is set in Charleston. And I also, because I'm not from here, and the character, Kate K, who moves down here, is not from here, it was very simpatico to be able to show her how she would see Southern women, how she would interact with, like how she would feel about like the weather and the different things that make Charleston Charleston. And so I like Kate K, the main character, is certainly not me, but in some ways it was easier for me to be able to like make the observations I've made over the last 5 years and infuse those into like how she sees and how she moves around the city.
Very good. Thank you. So,
Yeah.
any last remarks you have about the book that you'd like our readers to know? Other than it comes out January 7th, everybody.
Yeah, January 7th. I mean, I guess it's like, it's not a thing I want to know, but it is like, I do think it was unintentional, but I do think it's a book that like requires some dedication from the reader. Like if you're a reader who like usually just like likes to receive 100%, like doesn't want to have to like piece together little mysteries and like have, in this book, I think you do have to go back every once in a while and be like, okay, now there's a chapter from this character's perspective. Like I got to double check. I know who that character is, because you got to set yourself. Like it kind of requires a little bit of that. So I guess that's sort of like a disclaimer I'm putting on it, like you got to, I think in the end, you get rewarded for some of that, like attention to detail, but you do need to pay attention in this book. Cause like it is the details are the book, like a thing I mentioned on page 17 about something that Amanda and Kate love. Like I didn't just mention it arbitrarily. I mentioned it because it's probably going to matter. And like, so some of that like mental energy, like the reader needs to like infuse the book with some of their own sort of effort as well.
Yeah, definitely. I
So it's
definitely
work,
agree
is
with
what I'm
that.
saying. My book is work. Yeah.
It's work, but that makes it worth reading, I think. Like we going back to saying we've got some good like adult queer fiction out there, and it does take a little
Yep.
bit more work rather than just consuming. So what's next for you, Kate Fagan? What do people
I
expect
am.
next?
Yeah, I'm working on my second novel. And this one will probably be this one. Well, not probably. This one is definitely more in line with some of my previous work. Like I feel like this second book is sort of taking everything I've learned about like women and female athletes in the sports world and like telling a story about it. So
Ooh.
yeah,
Yeah, that definitely excites me.
yeah.
So very, very pumped to hear that. My friends would be disappointed if I did not ask this question. And so you know what question I'm about to ask you, but will free cookies return?
Oh, I
Please.
don't.
Not will, but when? When?
When? Never say never. But I think we're Kathryn and I are in the business of putting less work on our plate, not more. So we'll see. Like we'll see. But I wouldn't promise that it would. But I
Yeah.
love that you loved it though.
The kids in my youth group have this new thing they've taught me. It's PYP, protect your peace. And that's kind of been my
Okay.
motto lately. It's like PYP.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not
Yeah.
doing this
Okay.
thing. I'm not doing this project. PYP.
Oh,
Come
I
back
need
to
to
me.
adopt that. I got it. That is my new mantra.
When the timing's right, right? When the universe
That's right.
aligns correctly. All right, there we go, friends that told me to ask, especially my wife. And my final question for you is any good queer representation lately that you think our audience needs to be keen in on? What should they
Oh
be? What's
wow.
what's inspiring you lately? Good queer rep that we should know about. Good movie,
Well,
TV show.
I would say like if one book that I read in advance of this that I really love that I always want to shout out is Like a House on Fire,
Hmm.
by Lauren McBrayer. I don't know if you've read that one. Um, did you
I
know?
think I have. Is that the one where she's in an abusive relationship or no? Nope,
No,
different
they're
book
like,
then.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, there's nothing. I'm trying to think if there's anything I'm consuming right now on TV.
Like a house on fire.
We're currently watching Bad Sisters, the first season. Um,
Mm.
but a little bit of queer representation in that with one of the sisters. But no, I think Like a House on Fire. I feel like that's a book that didn't quite get its due, but falls into the category of like, trying a sapphic read that's sophisticated.
All right, I'm gonna put that on the bookstore's radar too. So our little queer rep bookshelf that they have, the little display, make sure it makes it there. All right.
That's right.
Thank you so much for joining us today,
Thanks.
Kate Fagan. Our audience
Thanks.
loved it. I loved it. Everyone, be really excited about this book. It's going to be a fun one to read during those cold winter nights. Thank you.
Thanks, Devan.